The theologian that I'm going to be using to discuss the issue of sin and evil is John Swinton. The book that I'm going to be taking most of it out of is Raging with Compassion, Pastoral Responses to the Problem of Evil. And I picked Swinton because I really think that his response in developing a community that's fortified against evil rather than focusing on theodicy is going to be very important to my project. He approaches the subject of sin and evil first by dealing with the question of theodicy. He discusses how, as society became more advanced in areas of science and technology, it seemed as if all problems could be solved and all answers uncovered. With so many medical advances, suffering no longer seems to be a given or even necessary. Yet this doesn't go with the reality of the brokenness of our world. He asks, how can we live as if Christ's victory were real when all around we see strong evidence that such a claim is at best an exaggeration, or worse, simply not so? Uncomfortable questions begin to emerge about the love and omnipotence of God when we are confronted with a reality that doesn't match our beliefs. Where is God in all our suffering? He suggests a way to reframe our theological approaches to sin and evil by moving away from attempting to explain it, and instead working as the early Christian communities did to develop practices that fortify the community against evil. In other words, instead of focusing on why evil exists and why God allows it to happen, our attention should be focused on building communities that absorb suffering and enable faithful living even in the midst of evil. Not all suffering is evil. It can be divided into moral evil and natural evil. Swinton explains that much of the evil and suffering of the world is of moral nature, and human beings are solely responsible for its existence. This type of unmerited suffering refused to be explained as punishment inflicted upon us as retribution for sin. Such suffering as when a child dies of abuse or a woman is raped lead us to question how bad things happen to good people. Often, in the face of unexplained suffering and evil, we turn to God with questions that have no easy answers. The experience of evil itself has the power to separate us from the only source of real hope, faith in a loving God who will bring liberation and redemption. On the other hand, natural evil does not come from human action, but is a byproduct of the world that we live in, and there's no one to blame. This includes earth events such as earthquakes, storms, as well as illness. The early church did not focus its theological reflection on why evil exists. Instead, the focus was on moving ahead in spite of the trials and tribulations of life, without the necessity for understanding or explaining why painful things were happening. Their response to the problem of evil and the existence of suffering was not to question God's goodness, love, and power, but rather to develop faithful forms of community within which the impact of evil and suffering could be absorbed, resisted, and transformed as they waited for God's return. He quotes Stanley Hauerhaus, who states that these early communities developed a community of care that has made it possible for them to absorb the destructive terror of evil that constantly threatened to destroy all human relationship. Suffering was not viewed as a problem needing a solution. Instead, it was considered a challenge that required a communal response. Since the early Christians lived with the hope of Christ's imminent return, they viewed life in the present as temporary. Christ's return would be the solution to any evil that befell them. This focus on the future of hope and liberation allowed the community to develop ways in which faith and hope could be nurtured. Swinton explains how pastoral practices themselves may turn evil when they attempt to and may result in the victim's separation from God when they're grounded in a theology that seeks to justify their suffering. Attempts to frame evil and all as part of the divine plan or as a process through which we grow closer to God often silence the sufferer and do more damage. Instead, he frames a response which is grounded in Jesus' solidarity with those who suffer. On the cross of Jesus, we discover victory and redemption, even when all that we see is defeat and suffering. On the cross, we see Jesus cry out and lament, forgiving his torturers and ensuring the care of his mother. It is through these gestures that we learn to build community of redemption and hope. In developing a practical theodicy, the community can begin to understand what it means to suffer with Christ by developing modes of practice that enable the church to recognize and witness the reality of Christ's providential redemptive action for the whole of creation, even in the midst of evil. By entering into human suffering and offering the possibility of hope, healing, and redemption despite the presence of evil, God opens up new vistas of hope for a world which often appears to be hopeless. He recommends 4 Christian practices that can form the basis of a more practical theodicy in community. Lamentation, which enables victims of evil to express anger and disappointment with God in a way that breaks through the silence and suffering of victims. Jesus spent the majority of his time on the cross in silence until he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Lament enables individuals and communities to move from silence into transformative speech that rages to God while at the same time reconciling them to God. Practicing forgiveness, through which Jesus calls on us to forgive those who have harmed us. Not everything is forgivable. That is forgivable is excusable, such as horrific acts of violence. Swinton suggests that we remember that it is people that we forgive, not acts, and if we bear in mind that they are human beyond the evil that they perpetrated, people who have a past where they too could have been victims, and a future that contains the promise of hope, that we can refocus ourselves away from revenge, framing forgiveness in such a way as to humanize the offender. This breaks open the possibility of God's continuing offer of salvation to all. Practicing thoughtfulness in a community grounded in love and hospitality of the other. This views individuals as intricately intertwined in community and with God. And last, friendship, grounded in Jesus's, in Matthew, where he says, "When I was a stranger, you welcomed me," offering hospitality to the stranger. He speaks about the principle of likeness and how we tend to make friends based on common interest. Jesus calls on us to make friendships of grace, as when we sit with strangers. In the early communities, Christians learned the radical hospitality of welcoming one another and loving each other in spite of differences. It is through this type of friendship that we in the United Church of Christ describe as extravagant welcome, that we learn to share God's friendship with strangers so that they might come to know God. The question that I would like to engage in is how is the issue of theodicy engaged in your faith community? How do you feel that a shift away from traditional views of theodicy is seeking to understand how God allows suffering towards a practice that fortifies the community to live through their suffering might actually transform the church?